Please, just a piece of bread, enough to make milk for my baby." The words cracked like dry wood in a dying fire. Mara Lark stood at the edge of the porch, snow falling around her in thick, silent curtains. Her boots were soaked through, her dress torn at the hem, and her arms trembled as she held the bundle pressed against her chest. Inside that bundle, wrapped in a threadbare shawl already stiff with ice, was Lainey, 1 year old, silent, too silent. The door had opened just a crack. A man stood there, broad-shouldered, face shadowed by the dim light of an oil lamp behind him. His eyes were gray, unreadable, like stones pulled from a frozen river. Callan Voss said nothing. Mara's breath came in short, desperate gasps. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her cheeks burned red from windburn. She had walked for miles through the storm, knocking on doors that never opened, begging from faces that turned away. This was the last house, the last chance. "I don't need charity," she said, voice trembling. "Just bread. Anything. Please." Callan's gaze dropped to the bundle in her arms. The shawl shifted slightly. A tiny hand, pale as wax, slipped free. The fingers didn't move. Mara saw him notice. She pulled the shawl tighter, panic rising in her throat. "She hasn't cried in hours," Mara whispered. "I have nothing left to give her. No milk, no warmth, nothing." Still Callan said nothing. The wind howled behind her, clawing at her back like a beast. The snow swirled in the space between them, thick and relentless. Mara's knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself. Then she did the only thing left. She sank to her knees in the snow. "Take her," Mara said, voice breaking. "Take the bread. Take her. Just let her live." She held the baby out with both hands, her arms shaking so violently the bundle nearly slipped. "I'm not asking you to keep me," she sobbed. "Just her, please. She deserves a warm home. I can't give her that. I've tried." Tears streamed down her face, freezing before they reached her jaw. Her breath came in ragged sobs, each one tearing through her chest like a blade. Callan stared at her, his jaw tightened, his hand gripped the edge of the door. For a long moment the world held its breath. Then he stepped forward. Without a word he pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around Mara's shoulders. The wool was warm, still holding the heat of the fire inside. She gasped, startled by the sudden kindness. He knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as he tucked the coat beneath her chin. Then he looked down at the baby. Lainey's face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. Her tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, fragile breaths. Callan reached out and touched her cheek with the back of his finger. His face remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Something old, something broken. He stood, turned back toward the door, and pushed it open wide. "Come inside," he said quietly. Mara blinked up at him, stunned. Her lips parted, but no words came. Callan didn't wait for an answer. He stepped forward, slid one arm beneath her shoulders, and helped her to her feet. She staggered, her legs weak from cold and hunger, but his grip was steady. He guided her across the threshold. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The smell of wood smoke and coffee filled the air. It was the first warmth Mara had felt in days. She stumbled forward, clutching Lainey tightly to her chest. Her body shook uncontrollably, not from cold anymore, but from the sudden, overwhelming relief. Callan closed the door behind them. The sound of the wind faded, muffled by the thick wooden walls. He didn't speak. He simply moved to the hearth, grabbed a folded quilt from the back of a chair, and spread it on the floor near the fire. "Sit," he said. Mara obeyed, her legs giving out as she sank onto the quilt. She unwrapped Lainey with trembling fingers, checking her tiny body for signs of life. The baby stirred, just a little. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and glassy, and she made a soft, weak sound. Mara sobbed again, pressing her forehead to Lainey's. "You're okay," she whispered. "You're okay." Callan knelt beside them. He set a tin cup of water on the floor within Mara's reach, then stood and walked to the kitchen. Mara watched him move through the small cabin. His steps were slow, deliberate, unhurried. He pulled a loaf of bread from a wooden box, tore off a piece, and placed it on a chipped plate. Then he poured milk into a small bowl and brought both back to the fire. He set them down beside her without a word. Mara stared at the bread. Her hands shook as she reached for it. She tore off a piece, stuffed it into her mouth, and chewed. The taste was plain, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever eaten. She ate slowly, forcing herself to swallow despite the tightness in her throat. Then she soaked another piece in the milk and pressed it gently to Lainey's lips. The baby's mouth opened. She sucked weakly at the softened bread, her tiny tongue moving slowly. Mara's tears fell freely now, silent and steady. Callan stood near the fire, arms crossed, watching them. His face was still unreadable, but his eyes never left the child. After a long silence, he spoke. "You can stay tonight," he said quietly. "There's a room in the back, small but it's warm." Mara looked up at him, her vision blurred with tears. "Why?" she whispered. Callan didn't answer right away. He looked down at the fire, the flames reflecting in his gray eyes. "Because," he said finally, his voice low and rough, "no one should have to beg to keep their child alive." He turned and walked toward the back of the cabin, disappearing into the shadows. Mara sat there, holding Lainey close, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them like a blanket. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, Mara felt safe. She didn't know this man, didn't know why he had let them in, but she knew one thing: he hadn't taken just the baby. He had taken both of them. And for tonight, that was enough. Dawn came slow and gray over the Wyoming plains. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world wrapped in white silence. Snow clung to the windows like lace curtains, and the air inside the cabin held the lingering warmth of last night's fire. Mara woke to the sound of boots moving across wooden floors. Her eyes fluttered open, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar surroundings. The small back room was warmer than any place she had slept in weeks. A patchwork quilt covered her shoulders, and beside her, Lainey lay peaceful in a makeshift crib lined with soft flannel. The baby's cheeks were pink now, not the terrible blue-white of last night. Her tiny chest rose and fell in steady, healthy breaths. Mara sat up slowly, her body aching but no longer shaking with cold. Through the frost-etched window she could see Callan in the yard. He moved with quiet purpose, splitting wood with powerful, measured swings. Steam rose from his shoulders in the crisp morning air. She had dreamed again. The same nightmare that haunted her sleep for weeks, running through endless snow. Lainey growing cold in her arms, doors slamming shut in her face. But here, watching this stranger work in his own yard, the terror felt distant. A soft knock came at the door. "Food's ready," Callan's voice called through the wood. Deep, careful, like a man who chose his words the way others chose their steps. Mara's stomach clenched with hunger. Real hunger, not the hollow ache of starvation she had carried for so long. She dressed quickly in her worn dress, now dry from the fire's warmth, and wrapped Lainey in the softest blanket she could find. When she stepped into the main room, the smell hit her first. Coffee. Real coffee. Black and strong. Bacon sizzling in an iron skillet, fresh bread cooling on a wooden board. Callan stood at the stove, his back to her. He had changed his shirt, she noticed. This one was cleaner, the fabric soft with age and wear. His movements were economical, practiced, like a man who had cooked for himself many times before. "Sit wherever you want," he said without turning around. The table was simple but solid, made from thick planks worn smooth by years of use. 2 plates sat waiting, flanked by mismatched cups and utensils that spoke of a life lived alone. Mara took the chair nearest the window. Lainey stirred in her arms, making soft sounds that were music after the terrible silence of yesterday. Callan brought the food over without ceremony. Scrambled eggs thick with butter, strips of bacon cooked just shy of burnt, bread sliced thick and spread with honey that caught the morning light like amber. He set a plate before her, then took the seat across the table. Close enough to talk, far enough to give her space. Mara stared at the food. It was more than she had seen in weeks. "Go on," Callan said quietly. "It's not getting any warmer." She didn't need to be told twice. The first bite of eggs nearly brought tears to her eyes. Warm, salted, perfect. She ate slowly at first, then faster as her body remembered what it meant to be fed. Callan ate in measured silence, his gray eyes occasionally drifting to Lainey, who had settled contentedly against Mara's chest. "She looks stronger," he said finally. Mara nodded, swallowing a piece of honey-sweetened bread. "She slept through the night. Haven't seen that in, I can't remember how long." "What's her name?" "Lainey," Mara said softly, adjusting the blanket around the baby's face. "Lainey Rose, after my grandmother." Callan nodded once. "Good name. And you're Callan Voss." That's right. The conversation felt careful, like two people walking on thin ice. But it was conversation, and that was more than Mara had enjoyed in weeks. Outside, the wind had died to nothing. Snow fell in fat, lazy flakes that stuck to the glass and melted slowly. "You don't have to tell me," Callan said suddenly, his voice lower now, "but how did you end up out there, in the storm?" Mara's hand stilled on Laney's back. The question she had been dreading, the one that made her stomach clench with shame and grief. "My husband died 6 weeks ago," she said quietly, not looking up from her plate. "Fever. Took him fast." Her voice caught slightly. "The bank came the next week, said the farm was mortgaged twice over. They gave me 3 days to clear out." Callan listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the table. "I tried to find work in town," Mara continued, "but no one wants to hire a woman with a baby, especially not one with no references, no family to vouch for her." She looked up at him then, her dark eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "I've been walking for 3 weeks, sleeping where I could, begging when I had to." The words came easier now, like water through a broken dam. "Yesterday was the worst day yet. 5 houses turned me away before I reached yours. One woman actually spat at me, called me a vagrant. Some people," Cullen said quietly, "mistake meanness for strength. Last night was the first time I really thought about—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the terrible thought that had driven her to her knees in the snow. "You don't have to say it," Callan said. "You saved us," Mara said simply. "Both of us. I know that." Callan was quiet for a long moment. He stared out the window, his weathered face unreadable. When he spoke again, his voice was so low she almost missed it. "I had a son once." Mara's breath caught. "His name was Thomas. He'd be about 3 now if he'd lived." Callan's hands tightened slightly on his coffee cup. "Lost him to the same fever that took your husband. Him and his mother both within a week of each other." "I'm sorry," Mara whispered. Callan shook his head slightly. 2 years now, long enough that most days I can think about something else. But last night when I saw her," he looked at Laney, his gray eyes soft with old pain. "She reminded me what it feels like to want to protect something small." The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier, but somehow warmer. The silence of shared understanding. "You can stay," Callan said finally. "Through the winter at least. I've got work that needs doing and this place gets too quiet sometimes." Mara stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I can't pay you anything." "I'm not asking for payment." "Then what are you asking for?" Callan considered this, his eyes still on the window. "Help, I suppose. Cooking, mending, the kinds of things I never learned to do right, in exchange for room and board until spring comes." It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, but something in his tone, in the careful way he wasn't quite looking at her, made Mara wonder if there was more to his offer than simple kindness. "That's generous," she said carefully. "It's practical," Callan replied. "I can use the help and you need a place to stay. Simple as that." But even as he said it, Mara caught something in his expression, a flicker of, what? Uncertainty? Fear? As if he was already regretting his impulse to help. What she didn't know was that outside, barely visible through the falling snow, a horse had passed by twice in the early morning hours. The same horse that had carried a rider who'd seen the glow of lamplight in Callan's windows the night before. Word was already spreading in town about the stranger Callan Voss had taken in, a woman with a baby and no husband, a woman with no past and no prospects. Some called it charity, others called it foolishness. But one man called it opportunity. And he was already making plans. 3 days passed like pages in a book Mara had never dared to read. Days filled with warmth and routine, and the simple miracle of knowing where her next meal would come from. She fell into the rhythm of Colin's life without meaning to, rising before dawn to stoke the fire and start coffee, preparing simple meals from supplies that seemed endless after weeks of hunger, mending his shirts with careful stitches while Laney slept in her makeshift crib. Callan worked outside mostly, tending to his small herd of cattle, repairing fences damaged by the storm. He spoke little, but his silences felt comfortable rather than cold. When he did speak, his words were measured, thoughtful. "You don't have to do all that," he said on the 3rd morning, watching her scrub his dishes with more care than they probably deserved. "I want to earn my keep," Mara replied, not looking up from the basin. "You're earning it just by being here." Something in his tone made her pause. She looked at him over her shoulder, soap bubbles clinging to her fingers. What do you mean? Callan was already reaching for his coat. Nothing, just, this place has been too quiet for too long. He left before she could ask what he meant by that. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. Mara was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard horses approaching, not the single horse of a neighbor dropping by, but multiple horses moving at a deliberate pace. Through the kitchen window, she watched 3 men dismount near Colin's front porch. They wore the kind of clothes that spoke of money and influence. Clean boots, pressed shirts, silver watch chains catching the afternoon light. The man in the center was older, maybe 50, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. The other 2 flanked him like guards, their hands resting casually near their gun belts. Callan emerged from the barn, his face carefully neutral. Mara couldn't hear their conversation from where she stood, but she could see the tension in Callan's shoulders, the way his hands hung loose at his sides. Ready. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes. The older man did most of the talking, gesturing occasionally toward the cabin. Once his gaze swept directly toward the window where Mara stood, and she stepped back instinctively. When the men finally remounted and rode away, Callan stood in the yard for a long time staring after them. Who were they? Mara asked when he came inside. Nobody important, Callan said, but his voice was tight. They seemed important to you. Callan hung his hat on the peg by the door and sat heavily at the table. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked tired. The one in the middle was Hamilton Reeves, he said finally. Owns most of the land around here, thinks he owns the people too. What did he want? Callan was quiet for so long that Mara thought he wouldn't answer. When he did speak, his voice was barely above a whisper. He made me an offer. What kind of offer? The kind that's not really an offer at all. Mara felt ice forming in her stomach. For the land. For you. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Mara's hands stilled on the dish towel she'd been folding. What do you mean? Callan looked up at her then, his gray eyes dark with something that might have been anger or fear or both. Seems word's gotten around town about my house guest, woman with a baby and no husband. People are talking. Let them talk. It's not that simple. Callan stood, began pacing the small space between the table and the stove. Reeves has been trying to buy this land for 2 years. I keep telling him no, so now he's looking for other ways to pressure me. And I'm the pressure. He offered to take you off my hands, said a man like me had no business harboring a woman of questionable character. His words, not mine. Mara's face burned with shame and anger. And what did you tell him? I told him to get off my land before I showed him the business end of my shotgun. The fierce protectiveness in his voice surprised them both. Callan stopped pacing, his face flushing slightly. I mean, he said more quietly, I told him you were none of his concern. But he'll be back. Probably. Mara sank into a chair, Lainey stirring restlessly in her arms. The baby could sense her mother's distress, the way children always could. I should go, Mara said quietly. I'm causing you trouble. No, the word came out harder than Callan intended. No, you're not going anywhere. But if this Reeves wants your land, Hamilton Reeves can want whatever he likes. Doesn't mean he's going to get it. Mara looked up at him, searching his face. Why are you doing this? Really? It can't just be about your son. Callan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. Because I'm tired of being afraid, he said. Tired of letting other people decide what's right for me. I lost everything once. My wife, my boy, damn near my mind along with them. I swore I'd never let anyone else dictate how I lived my life. He sat down across from her, his hands flat on the table between them. You and Lainey, you're not charity cases. You're the first thing I've cared about protecting in 2 years. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let Hamilton Reeves or anyone else drive you away. The words settled between them like a bridge being built, fragile but real. What happens now? Mara asked. Now we wait, and we prepare. For what? Callan's jaw tightened. For whatever Reeves decides to do next, because a man like that doesn't take no for an answer. Not ever. That night, as wind howled around the cabin and snow began to fall again, Mara lay awake listening to Callan move restlessly in the main room. She heard him checking the windows, testing the door latch, the soft whisper of metal on leather as he cleaned his rifle. Outside, the darkness felt different. Not empty, but watching waiting. And in town, 12 miles away, Hamilton Reeves sat in his study pouring whiskey and making plans of his own, plans that involved more than just Callan Voss and his stubborn refusal to sell. Plans that involved the woman with no past and the baby with no father. Plans that would change everything. The attack came at dawn, when the world was caught between night and day, when shadows played tricks on tired eyes and the mind was slow to separate dream from reality. Mara woke to the sound of breaking glass. Not the gentle tinkle of a cup dropped by accident, but the violent crash of a window exploded inward by force. She sat up in bed, heart hammering, Laney's cries piercing the morning stillness like a knife. "Callan," she called out, but there was no answer. More sounds now. Boots on the front porch, voices low and rough speaking words she couldn't make out but didn't need to understand, the scrape of metal against wood, the ominous creak of floorboards under unwelcome feet. Mara snatched Laney from her crib and pressed herself against the back wall of the small room. The baby's cries grew louder, more frantic, as if she could sense the danger that filled the air like smoke. "Shh, baby, shh," Mara whispered, rocking her daughter desperately. "Please, Laney, be quiet. Please." Through the thin wall, she heard Callan's voice, steel hard and dangerous. "Get out of my house." Now, Callan, came another voice, smooth as oil and twice as slick. "Hamilton Reeves. Is that any way to greet old friends? We're not friends. Never have been. Such hostility. And here I thought we'd settled our differences yesterday. We settled nothing. I told you to stay away from my land." "Your land?" Reeves laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "See, that's where you're wrong, my friend. This land belongs to the bank as of yesterday morning. Seems you've fallen behind on your payments." Silence. A terrible, heavy silence that made Mara's blood turn to ice. "That's impossible," Colin said finally. "I paid every cent I owed." "Did you?" "Because according to my friend at the bank you've missed 3 payments. Very unfortunate. Of course I'd be happy to help you out of this predicament. All you have to do is sign this little paper here, and your debt disappears." "And the woman? What about her?" "She stays with me." Another laugh, colder this time. "Oh, I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, a woman of her particular circumstances, well, she needs proper guidance, the kind only a man of means can provide, over my dead body." "That can be arranged." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mora pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob, Laney's cries muffled against her chest. She heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Now, Callan," Reeves said, his voice losing its false friendliness, "let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Sign the paper, walk away, live to see another sunrise. And if I don't? Well then, we'll just have to assume you died defending your property from claim jumpers. Tragic, really. But these things happen on the frontier." Mara's mind raced. She had to do something. Callan was outnumbered, outgunned. In moments he would be dead, and she and Laney would be at the mercy of Hamilton Reeves. She looked around the small room desperately. There in the corner, leaning against the wall where Callan had left it the night before, a shotgun. Her hands shook as she picked it up. It was heavier than she'd expected, the metal cold against her palms. She'd never fired a gun in her life, but she'd watched her husband clean his hunting rifle enough times to understand the basics. Cock the hammer, aim, pull the trigger. She crept to the door, Laney balanced on her hip, the shotgun clutched in her free hand. Through the crack she could see into the main room. Callan stood near the fireplace, hands raised, 3 men facing him with drawn weapons. Reeves stood behind them, a contract in one hand, a smug smile on his face. "Time's up, Callan," Reeves said. "What's it going to be?" "Go to hell." Wrong answer. The man nearest to Callan raised his pistol, finger tightening on the trigger. Mara didn't think. She threw open the door and stepped into the room, the shotgun raised to her shoulder. "Don't move," she shouted. Every head turned toward her. The men with guns swung their weapons in her direction, but hesitated when they saw the baby in her arms. Well, Reeves said, his smile widening. "The mysterious Miss Lark, how good of you to join us." "Stay back," Mara warned, her voice shaking but determined. "I'll shoot." "With a baby in your arms?" "I don't think so." "Try me." For a moment the room balanced on a knife's edge. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then one of Reeves' men made his mistake. He shifted his weight, angling his gun toward Callan's back. Mara pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared like thunder, the recoil slamming her backward against the wall. The blast caught the gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying across the room. Chaos erupted. Callan dove behind the table as the other two men opened fire. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. Bullets whined through the air like angry hornets. Mara scrambled back toward the bedroom, Laney screaming in her arms. Behind her she heard Callan return fire, the sharp crack of his rifle cutting through the din. "Kill them both," Reeves shouted over the noise. "And bring me the woman." But his men were already falling back, their wounded companion bleeding heavily, their initial advantage lost to surprise and Callan's deadly accuracy. "This isn't over," Reeves snarled as they retreated toward the door. "You hear me, Voss? This isn't over." "It is if you come back," Callan called after them. "Next time I won't aim to wound." The sound of horses faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence broken only by Laney's frightened cries and the slow drip of blood on the wooden floor. Callan appeared in the bedroom doorway, his face pale, a cut on his cheek where a splinter had grazed him. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Mara shook her head, unable to speak. The shotgun lay at her feet where she dropped it, smoke still curling from the barrel. "The baby?" "She's fine," Mara managed. "Scared, but fine." Callan knelt beside them, his hands gentle as he examined them both for injuries. Finding none, he sat back on his heels and looked at her with something like awe. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You saved mine first. That was different. This what you did, it took real courage." Mara laughed, a sound caught somewhere between hysteria and relief. "I was terrified." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Callan said. "It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "But he was right about one thing," Callan said, his voice growing darker. "This isn't over. Reeves won't give up now. Not after what happened here." "Then what do we do?" Callan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he considered their options. "We leave," he said finally. "Tonight. Pack what we can carry and get as far away from here as possible." "Where will we go?" "North. I've got a friend in Montana, owns a ranch near the Canadian border. Reeves' influence doesn't reach that far." Mara nodded, though the thought of running again, of leaving behind the first real home she'd known in months, made her heart ache. "What about your land, your cattle?" Callan's jaw tightened. "Land can be replaced. Cattle can be bought. But you and Laney—" He looked down at the baby in her arms, then back at Mara. "Some things are worth more than property." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. That evening, as they prepared to leave the only sanctuary they'd known, Mara found herself watching Callan pack his few belongings. He moved with quiet efficiency, but she could see the pain in his eyes as he looked around the cabin one last time. "This was your home," she said softly. "Home isn't a place," Callan replied, shouldering his pack. "It's the people you're willing to fight for." He looked at her then, his gray eyes intense in the lamplight. "Ready?" Mara adjusted Laney in her arms and picked up her own small bundle of possessions, everything she owned in the world, including the two people she'd come to care about more than her own life. "Ready." But as they stepped out into the cold night air, neither of them saw the figure watching from the tree line. The man who would ride hard to town with news of their escape. The man who would ensure that Hamilton Reeves knew exactly which direction they'd headed. The chase was just beginning. They rode through the night, like souls fleeing judgment, the cold wind cutting through their clothes, and the darkness swallowing the sound of their horses' hooves. Callan led the way on his black gelding, Mara behind him on the gentle mare, Laney bundled tight against her chest. The baby had stopped crying hours ago, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait. But Mara could feel her daughter's small body tense with each unfamiliar sound, each shift in the wind that might herald pursuit. "How much farther?" Mara called softly. "Maybe 10 miles to the canyon pass," Callan replied. "Once we're through there, we'll be harder to track." But even as he said it, Callan knew they were being followed. He'd seen the dust cloud on the horizon just before sunset, moving too fast to be anything but mounted men with purpose. Behind them, Hamilton Reeves rode hard with 8 men, his face set in grim determination. "Devil's Canyon," one of his men reported. "Fresh tracks 3 hours old." Reeves smiled coldly. Perfect. They've trapped themselves. The first light of dawn was painting the eastern sky when Callan and Mara reached the mouth of Devil's Canyon. The passage yawned before them like an open throat, its walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. This is it, Callan said, dismounting to study the narrow trail ahead. Once we're in there, there's only one way out. A rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, the bullet striking the rock just inches from Callan's head. Too late, he muttered, grabbing the reins of both horses. They found us. More shots rang out as riders poured over the ridge behind them. Callan fired back with his rifle, buying them precious seconds as he helped Mara remount. Ride, he shouted. I'll be right behind you. They plunged into the canyon at a gallop, hooves echoing off stone walls like thunder. The trail wound deeper, sometimes wide, sometimes narrow. But as they rounded a sharp bend, their hearts sank. 4 men waited at the far end of the pass, rifles raised, blocking their escape. They were trapped. Callan pulled his horse to a stop, his mind racing through options that didn't exist. Behind them the sound of pursuit grew louder. Ahead, certain death waited. What do we do? Mara whispered. Before Callan could answer, Hamilton Reeves himself appeared around the bend behind them, flanked by his remaining men. His face bore a satisfied smile. End of the line, Callan, he called out. Nowhere left to run. Maybe not, Callan replied, his hand moving toward his rifle. But a man can still choose how he faces the end. How noble, how utterly pointless. Reeves dismounted, walking closer. You know what I want? The woman and the child. Give them to me, and I might let you ride out alive. We both know that's a lie. Perhaps, but it's the only offer you're going to get. Mara felt something shift inside her then. Not fear, but anger. White-hot rage at this man who would tear apart their fragile happiness for the sake of land and pride. I have something to say, she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the enclosed space. Reeves turned toward her, eyebrows raised. By all means, my dear. Mara handed Laney to Callan, then dismounted and walked forward until she stood between the 2 groups of armed men. You want me, she said, looking directly at Reeves. Fine, I'll come with you. But you let Callan and my daughter go. Mara, no, Callan said, but she didn't turn around. Interesting, Reeves mused. But I need more than just you. The child comes too. Over my dead body, Callan snarled. But Mara wasn't finished. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age. This is a deed to a ranch in California, 3,000 acres worth more than this territory. Reeves' eyes narrowed. You're lying. The land office has a copy. You want property? I can give you real property. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Around them the canyon walls seemed to lean inward, waiting. Reeves studied the paper, his greed warring with suspicion. 3,000 acres in California would be worth a fortune. This is genuine? He asked finally. Every word. And you'd sign it over? Just like that? For our freedom? Yes. Callan had heard enough. Mara, don't do this. That land is yours. She turned to look at him, her eyes soft with love and determination. Land is just dirt and grass, she said, echoing his words. What matters is the people you choose to stand with. The words hit Reeves like a physical blow. For the first time doubt crept into his expression. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. But looking at Mara's face, at the quiet strength in her eyes, he realized he was fighting something he didn't understand. Something that couldn't be bought or taken by force. You'd give up everything, he said slowly. For him? I'd give up everything for my family. And in that moment, watching this woman stand fearless between armed men, offering everything she owned to protect the people she loved, Hamilton Reeves understood that he had already lost. He could take the land. He could kill Callan. He could force Mara to come with him. But he could never have what she was offering freely to another man. He could never inspire loyalty that would make someone sacrifice everything without hesitation. Keep your land, he said finally, his voice hollow with defeat. All of it. He turned to his men. We're leaving. As Reeves and his men filed out of the canyon, Callan and Mara stood alone in the growing daylight. Laney had fallen asleep in Callan's arms, peaceful and unaware. The deed, Callan said quietly. Was it real? Mara smiled, showing him the blank interior of what had been just an old letter, but he never bothered to look closely. Callan laughed, a sound of pure relief and admiration. "You magnificent, impossible woman." He reached for her with his free arm, pulling her close. "I love you," he said simply. "I should have said it before." "I love you too," she whispered against his chest. "Both of you." 6 months later, in a small church in the Montana Territory, Callan Voss married Mara Lark before God and a handful of witnesses. Laney now walking and chattering scattered flower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy. They built their new life on a ranch where the mountains stretched endlessly toward heaven, and the past felt as distant as the stars. Mara learned to ride and rope. Callan learned to braid a little girl's hair and tell bedtime stories. And on quiet evenings when Laney was asleep and the fire burned low, they would sit together and remember the night when a desperate woman begged for bread and found instead a family worth fighting for. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the smallest acts of kindness. Sometimes home isn't a place you're born to, but a choice you make when everything else has been stripped away, except the courage to care for another human soul.